My grandma left me his private jet, but my boss told me to use it for company trips without paying a dime. You should be grateful, he said. When I refused, he fired me. 2 weeks later, I flew over his office in my jet with my new employer. Enjoy your meeting? I laughed. I never expected to own a private jet. I never even expected to sit in one. People like me didn't just stumble into that kind of wealth. I wasn't a billionaire's kid. I didn't run some tech startup, and I damn sure didn't win the lottery. I was just a regular guy, working a 9-to-5 sales job, punching numbers into spreadsheets, shaking hands with clients I didn't care about, and trying to keep my boss happy enough to get a halfway decent raise every year. And for 7 years, that's exactly what I did. I worked my ass off at Brightwell Logistics, a mid-sized shipping and freight company based out of Chicago. We weren't some Fortune 500 giant, but we had big clients, corporations that needed their cargo moved fast, efficiently, and with as little hassle as possible. That's where I came in. My job was to make sure they stayed happy, which meant endless meetings, client calls, and business trips to godforsaken places where people cared way too much about shipping containers. It wasn't glamorous, but paid the bills. It paid for my one-bedroom apartment, my used Toyota Camry, and my overpriced takeout habit. It wasn't a dream, but it was stable. Then my grandmother died. Miriam Carter was a force of nature. She was sharp, stubborn, and didn't take crap from anyone. She and my grandfather built a successful charter flight business back in the 60s, catering to high-end clients who wanted the luxury of private travel. When my grandfather passed, she sold off most of the business, except for one jet, her favorite. I knew she still had it, but I never thought about what would happen to it when she was gone. I figured it would be sold off like the rest of her assets, maybe split between family members, maybe just disappear into some legal mess I wouldn't be involved in. I was wrong. At the will reading, I sat in a stiff-backed chair, listening as the lawyer droned on about property, stocks, and various financial assets that had been carefully divided among family members. I wasn't expecting much, maybe a little money, something sentimental. But then the lawyer looked at me and said something that made my stomach drop. To Riley Carter, she leaves her Gulfstream G650. I almost laughed. A jet? I asked, half expecting someone to correct him. Like a real jet? The lawyer barely glanced up from his papers. Yes. My parents, sitting across from me, both stiffened. My dad's jaw clenched so tight, I thought his teeth might crack. He had never understood why Grandma clung to that jet. To him, it was a relic, an unnecessary extravagance that should have been sold years ago. Are you sure? I asked. Like, you didn't mix something up? The lawyer gave me a dry look, clearly unimpressed. Your grandmother was very clear in her wishes. She wanted you to have it. I sat there, stunned. I owned a damn jet. And not just any jet. The Gulfstream G650 was top of the line. This wasn't some rusting, outdated plane sitting in a desert somewhere. It was a sleek, multi-million-dollar machine, still maintained, still operational, still mine. And Grandma, being the meticulous woman she was, hadn't just dumped it in my lap without a plan. She'd set up a trust to cover maintenance, fuel, and operational costs for 5 years. 5 whole years where I didn't have to worry about a single expense. I was still processing this when my dad spoke. This doesn't make any sense, he said sharply. The lawyer didn't blink. It was her decision. My dad turned to me, his eyes narrowing. What are you going to do with it? I opened my mouth, then closed it. I don't know. He exhaled, rubbing his temple. You should sell it. I knew that's what he wanted. He thought Grandma had been irrational for holding on to it. He thought I'd be just as irrational if I kept it. I don't know yet, I said again, because I truly didn't. I walked out of that office feeling like I'd stepped into someone else's life. My car, my apartment, my entire existence suddenly felt small in comparison to the jet waiting for me in a hangar in Miami. I didn't know it yet, but that jet was about to ruin my life. I made the mistake of telling my boss about it. Barry Holden was the kind of man who wore tailored suits, drove a Mercedes he couldn't really afford, and made a show of ordering the most expensive steak on the menu at business dinners. He had the kind of fake charm that made you like him just enough to forget that he was an absolute vulture. It slipped out over lunch. We were at one of those overpriced steakhouses downtown, the kind where the cheapest thing on the menu cost more than my groceries for a week. Barry was rambling about some upcoming client meetings, complaining about travel expenses, when I stupidly said, well, I won't have to worry about flights anymore. He frowned. What do you mean? I hesitated, but then, like an idiot, I told him. His eyes lit up. A private jet? He repeated, leaning forward like a shark scenting blood. You own a private jet? Yeah. His grin widened. That's incredible, man. You know, we spend a fortune on flights for client meetings. This would be a game changer. I frowned. What do you mean? Well, he said, as if it were obvious, you've got this jet just sitting there. Why not put it to use? We could fly out for meetings in style, impress clients, and save a ton on travel expenses. I blinked. Wait, are you saying you want to use my jet for company trips? Think about it. Riley, he said smoothly. You should be grateful to have something like this. It's not like you're using it every day, right? Why not let the company benefit from it? For free? I asked incredulously. Barry gave a dismissive wave. It's good for business. If the company does well, you do well. I stared at him. Barry, that's not how this works. He chuckled. Come on, man. Don't be selfish. That was the moment I knew Barry wasn't asking. He was expecting. And when I refused, Barry didn't like being told no. The pressure started almost immediately. Little comments, subtle digs, guilt trips. In meetings, he'd joke about how it would be so much easier if we had a private jet at our disposal. In private, he started pushing harder. You know, Riley, he said one afternoon, standing in my office doorway, there are guys here who would KLL for the opportunities you've had. You've been lucky. You should start thinking about giving back. I clenched my jaw. I do. By working my ass off. His smile never wavered. But his eyes? His eyes were cold. 2 days later, I got called into HR. And just like that, 7 years down the drain. Barry shook my hand on the way out. Fake sympathy oozing from him. I hope there are no hard feelings, Riley. I smiled. None at all. I already had a plan. And Barry was going to regret it. Getting fired should have been a disaster. 7 years of grinding, and just like that, I was out on my ass. No severance, no job prospects lined up, nothing. A week earlier, I'd thought I was secure. I was a top performer. But Barry Holden didn't care about performance. He cared about power. And I'd taken power away from him when I told him no. At first, I sat in my apartment, stewing. I wasn't just pissed. I was humiliated. I had built relationships with clients, closed massive deals, made that company money, and the second I didn't roll over, I was disposable. I should have seen it coming. Barry had tried to act like it was a standard company decision, performance issues, not being a team player, the usual corporate garbage. But people talked. And when one of my coworkers, Mason, called me the next day, I got the real story. Dude, he said, voice low, you got screwed. Yeah, I muttered, pacing my living room. No, like worse than you think, Mason continued. Barry started talking SH about you immediately after you left. Said you were ungrateful and not a good fit for the company's culture anymore. I laughed bitterly. Culture? What? The let's all kiss Barry's ass culture. That's not the worst part, Mason said. He told the execs that you quit voluntarily because you didn't have the company's best interests at heart. I froze. He what? He spun it like you walked away, Mason said. Which means I can't even file for unemployment. I finished, realization sinking in. I clenched my jaw. Barry planned this. This wasn't some heat-of-the-moment decision. No, he had set me up the second he realized I wasn't going to let him use my jet. He went behind my back, built a narrative, and pulled the trigger before I even had a chance to fight it. And he wasn't done. Mason sighed. Look, man, I don't know if you're thinking about getting another job in sales, but Barry's already poisoning the well. I gritted my teeth. Explain. He's been making calls to other companies, Mason said, saying you were difficult to work with, that you didn't understand company loyalty. Son of a... I ran a hand over my face. Barry hadn't just fired me. He was trying to make sure I wouldn't work in the industry ever again. That's when my anger turned into something sharper. Something cold. Because Barry thought he'd won. He thought he could ruin my career, wreck my future, and walk away without consequences. He thought I'd go quietly. He had no idea what was coming. Barry had made one fatal mistake. He underestimated me. He saw me as some corporate drone, a guy who would take his punishment and fade into the background. What he forgot, or maybe never knew, was that my grandmother didn't raise me to be a pushover. She built a business from nothing. She survived in an industry dominated by ruthless men who didn't want a woman taking up space. She fought for every inch of success, and she didn't teach me how to roll over. She taught me how to fight back. I had a jet. I had connections. And most importantly, I had nothing to lose. So I made some calls. The first one was to Victor Renault, a name I remembered from my grandmother's old contacts. Victor was a high-powered investor, the kind of guy who specialized in hostile takeovers. His entire business model was built on spotting vulnerable companies, buying them out, and gutting them for profit. And guess what? Brightwell Logistics had been on his radar for months. I met Victor in New York. The man was intimidating as sharp suit, sharp eyes, sharp everything. He didn't waste time with small talk. You work for Brightwell, he said, swirling his whiskey. Why are you here? I smiled. Because I have something you might be interested in. I laid it out for him. Barry Holden is bleeding the company dry. He's cutting corners, inflating executive bonuses, and making STPID decisions. The company is vulnerable. Profits look good on paper, but internally, the structure is cracking. I have insider knowledge. I know which clients are unhappy, which accounts are unstable, and where the bodies are buried. Victor listened. He didn't interrupt. just watched me with those piercing blue eyes, his expression unreadable. Then he leaned back, tapped his fingers against his glass, and said, "Interesting." That's when I knew I had him. While Victor worked on the big picture, I focused on Barry himself. The man loved his reputation. He thrived on power, on looking like the guy who had it all together. So I hit him where it hurt. First, I called in a few favors. See, Barry had pissed off a lot of people over the years. Employees he fired unfairly. Clients he screwed over. Even some higher-ups who didn't like how he ran things, but put up with him because he delivered results. I gave him anonymity and a platform. I started leaking inside information. Barry's shady expense reports. His backdoor deals. His attempts to cut employee benefits while securing himself a bigger bonus. And then, I went for his clients. I knew exactly which ones were on the fence about leaving Brightwell. I knew what pissed them off, what they wanted that Barry wasn't giving them. So I made calls. I introduced them to Victor's people. And one by one, they started jumping ship. Barry didn't know what was happening at first. But when two of the company's biggest clients pulled their contracts in the same week, panic set in, and I wasn't done yet. Barry was unraveling. Mason kept me updated. He said Barry was snapping at employees, holding last-minute emergency meetings, trying to plug holes in a sinking ship. And the best part? He still had no idea it was me. Not yet, but he was about to find out. Because the next step, that's where things got personal. Barry was unraveling, and I was just getting started. Brightwell Logistics was bleeding clients, employees were jumping ship, and the higher-ups were starting to notice. But here's the thing about corporate holies like Barry. They never think they're the problem. They always assume it's someone else's fault. So, when things started going south, Barry didn't look inward. He didn't think, maybe I shouldn't have fired the guy who knew all the company's weak spots. No, Barry did what Barry always did. He blamed other people. He started cracking down on his employees, demanding longer hours, pushing pointless meetings, and micromanaging the out of everything. He became paranoid, convinced there was a leak in the company. There was. But by the time he figured that out, it was too late. The moment everything came crashing down for Barry started with an email. I sent it, but it wasn't just for me. See, I've been collecting evidence. A little here, a little there. Expense reports, internal memos, emails Barry thought were deleted, but were actually archived in Brightwell servers. Barry had been embezzling company funds for years. Nothing huge, nothing that would get noticed at first glance. Just small, consistent siphons. Overinflated business trip expenses. Fake vendor payments that led back to his own shell companies. It was subtle. It was clever. But it wasn't clever enough. Because once I had everything I needed, I packaged it neatly, wrote up a detailed report, and sent it to every board member at Brightwell Logistics. And I CC Barry. The panic must have set in instantly. Mason told me later that Barry burst out of his office, red-faced, gripping his phone like he wanted to throw it. He went straight to the executive floor, probably thinking he could spin the situation, talk his way out of it. But it was too late. The board had everything. A full breakdown of where the money had gone. Screenshots of his shady deals. And worst of all, evidence that he had been actively covering it up while cutting employee benefits and pushing for budget cuts. Barry was screwed. By the end of the day, he was escorted out of the building. No farewell speech. No golden parachute. Just a box of his belongings and a security guard walking him to the door. Poetic, right? But I wasn't done yet. Barry thought I had just ruined his career. But the best part? I had already lined up his replacement. Victor Renault had been working behind the scenes, moving the final pieces into place. While Barry was drowning in corporate scandal, Victor had been buying up Brightwell's stock quietly, securing enough control to force a leadership change. And guess who Victor recommended for a senior executive position? Me. I didn't take Barry's exact job. I didn't want it. But I took a role where I had enough authority to make sure Brightwell was run right. Barry? The last I heard, he tried to start his own logistics consulting firm. It flopped, because no one trusts a guy who got fired for embezzlement. And me? I spent my first business trip as an executive flying in my own private jet, drinking top-shelf whiskey, and looking down at the city skyline, knowing that Barry Holden was sitting in some dingy office, wondering how he lost everything. Barry thought he could screw me over and walk away unscathed. But I played the long game. And in the end, I didn't just win. I made sure he knew exactly why he lost. And damn, it felt good. Barry was finished. Fired. Disgraced. His reputation? Destroyed. His future in the industry? Non-existent. But I wanted to make sure he truly understood who had done this to him. So, a week after his firing, I sent him a message. Just 4 words. Enjoy your meeting, Barry. No threats. No insults. Just a simple, unmistakable reminder of the moment everything had started to fall apart for him. Mason later told me that Barry had read the email, turned bright red, and stormed out of the cafe where he was trying and failing to network his way back into the business world. Poetic justice. Victor gave me a seat at the table, and Brightwell underwent a massive restructuring. Employees who had been mistreated under Barry finally got raises and benefits. The toxic culture he created? Gone. The clients Barry lost? We brought them back with better deals. The company thrived under new leadership. And as for me, well, I didn't need to worry about corporate politics anymore. With my new salary, my connections, and my grandmother's jet, I had freedom. I traveled when I wanted. I worked with people who actually valued me. And I never, ever had to deal with another Barry Holden again. One day, about 6 months later, I was at a business conference in Miami, dressed in a sharp suit, drink in hand, talking to powerful people, the kind Barry used to kiss up to. And then I saw him. Barry. He looked rough, not the confident, smooth-talking executive he once was. His suit was cheap, his eyes tired, and he was desperately trying to impress a group of businessmen who weren't giving him the time of day. For a moment, I considered walking over, saying something, rubbing it in. But then I realized something. Barry didn't need me to tell him he lost. He knew. So instead, I just smiled, lifted my glass in his direction, and walked away. Because the best revenge? It wasn't ruining him. It was knowing that I won, and that he would never recover.